Now, my dad has been a physician, a dentist, but also an oral surgeon, and he said when I was growing up, when I was 15, about to get my driver's license, he said, don't sign the organ donor card. And I said, why? And he said, well, a lot of hospitals actually won't save you to get the organ. Some of them are corrupt. Some of them are making money off of it. Some of the doctors own part of the hospitals. And I thought he was full of it until it came out on 60 Minutes about 5 years later. And I was sitting at my grandparents' house in Austin watching TV, and they admitted on there that in Austin, Dallas, Chicago, and it listed cities where they were basically letting people die. I'm not saying this happened in the case of this young man, so they could get their organs. They were telling him, his organs are damaged, man. We need to take him off life support. We want to get those organs for somebody else. But she waited just another day, and he lived.
But he was dead a total of 15 minutes. When he came back, they said he would never be normal again. They told me the oxidation problems would be so bad to his brain that he would be a vegetable, even if he made it.
So I'm telling you, this is something you need to know about. This is very important because, again, they tell you turn people off. You ought to wait a while before you turn them off, because a lot of times they come back. My uncle was in a tumor for 6 months, came back, he's fine today. Well, here's a clip about the family and the child, or they'd already decided to turn him off, but then he came back. Here it is.
This is what he does to play.
For 13-year-old Trenton McKinley, playing with his remote control car is one of the only things he can do right now.
I think a lot more before doing stuff now.
You can see he's missing half of his skull.
He was walking around with neither side in. They just put this piece back in.
His mother, Jennifer Reindahl, says she's just thankful he's alive. 2 months ago, Trenton was at a friend's house, sitting in a small utility trailer like this one, while being pulled by a dune buggy. A day of playing soon turned terrifying.
And flipped, and I hit the concrete, and the trailer landed on top of my head. After that, I don't remember anything.
Trenton was rushed to USA Medical Center. He had 7 skull fractures.
And all I saw was a stretcher with his feet. They actually stapled that side shut so they could get him back breathing, but he was dead a total of 15 minutes. When he came back, they said he would never be normal again. They told me the oxidation problems would be so bad to his brain that he would be a vegetable, even if he made it.
For the next several days, Trenton was brain dead and barely breathing. His parents faced with a difficult decision. They signed the papers to donate his organs.
5 kids needed organs that matched him, and it was unfair to keep bringing him back, because it was just damaging his organs even more.
But a day before doctors were set to pull the plug, Trenton started coming back. He believes he was in heaven.
I was walking down. It was more like an open field, walking straight. There's no other explanation but God. There's no other way that I could have came back. Even the doctor said.
Slowly but surely, Trenton is making strides beyond what anyone expected.
All right. He's a miracle, and he just amazes everybody. Every day he gets more and more.
But it's not without a struggle. He's lost 50 pounds and deals with nerve pain and seizures daily. Despite all that, this kid still got a great sense of humor.
I said I could turn my head sideways and put salsa in there and eat chips and dip out of my head.
You're a man.
No more washing dishes for me. She wouldn't let me put nothing in it though.
Of course not.
I really wanted to see if I could.
In Mobile, Devin Cafera.
I'm here with Dr. Paul Byrne, a neonatologist for many, many years. When did you start practicing, doctor?
I started to practice in 1957.
So you've been practicing longer than I've been alive, despite my gray beard, and you're about to give a talk on brain death or real death or something along those lines. The title of the talk tonight?
Actually, our talk revolves around life. We protect and preserve life from conception until true death. We have no exceptions, and we emphasize the fact that brain death is not true death. It never was and never will be. And everybody that's declared brain dead is a living person. They all have beating hearts and circulation and respiration, and they declare them brain dead so that they can get beating hearts for transplant, beating hearts and other healthy organs. Every organ that's transplanted is a healthy organ, and it must come from a living person, because you don't need to be a genius to know that from a cadaver or a corpse you can't get much.
Now, a lot of people, including my own wife as a nurse, are organ donors and believe this to be a proper thing to do. Are they incorrect in the whole? Are they incorrect in general? Where are they off?
I don't know about whole in general. All I know is that there is no way to get an organ for transplantation unless it's a healthy organ. And every time an organ is taken for transplantation, it's taken from somebody who has a beating heart, circulation, and respiration. And in order to get those organs, the donor has to be paralyzed so that they don't move, and they are not given any anesthetic. So when they're paralyzed and they're cut on without an anesthetic, still they respond by an increase in heart rate and blood pressure that wouldn't happen to a corpse. That's always a living person.
Now, doctor, you've been involved in medicine, as you said, 1957. You're talking 55 years. You've seen all sorts of things come and go. One thing that I don't understand in all of this is, if the call for a doctor is to preserve life, why would you end life for one to bring it to another?
Why would you?
You don't get much more direct than that. And this will be the subject of your talk tonight.
Absolutely. We say the truth. Actually, just so you know about me, I'm a neonatologist, and I'm one of the pioneers in the field of neonatology. I started a special care nursery at Cardinal Glennon Hospital in St. Louis in 1963.
The year I was born.
Yes, there were no treatments for sick babies when we started. And I was the one that invented how to take blood pressure on premature babies. Invented many other things too, how to give them nutrition in the vein. We identified the need for giving them copper and zinc and magnesium and other things. Those things are known throughout medicine now, but we started before any of that was known.
So now this is something that I'm wondering. You are a pioneer in these fields. You're a person with long credentials, worldwide known for all that you've done. People, young children are alive today because of the treatments and the methods that you pioneered. Yet when you give something like this, we do have a good crowd here tonight. Why isn't the medical field giving this more credibility or more?
Well, the medical field does give, what I say, a lot of credibility. It's in medical journals, not just by me, but by many doctors. There are many, many people saying that brain death is not true death, and so it doesn't come from just me. And so why isn't what I say allowed to be given to the public? Because if the public realizes that there are killing people to get organs, then people are not going to sign up to be an organ donor.
And that seems to be the explanation. Well, doctor, thank you very much for giving me some time before your speech.
Yes.
My presentation will begin with recordings from the television of several cases that have occurred in recent time.
Remarkable 21-year-old from Oklahoma who came back from the dead. Our national correspondent Natalie Morales has his incredible story. Natalie?
Well, Matt, Zach Dunlap's story is one I will certainly never forget. To say that this much-loved warehouse worker got a 1 in a million break is a huge understatement. Really, there are no statistics for what happened to Zach. As for his family, this was a tragedy that turned into a real-life miracle.
Zach Dunlap liked driving souped-up four-wheelers along with his friends until last November when he lost control and flipped. The prognosis couldn't have been worse. With no brain activity evident, Oklahoma authorities were notified that Zach had died. While his parents struggled to cope with the crushing news, they gave consent for Zach's organs to be donated.
We wanted to make sure that some lucky person got to live on through Zach's heart.
With a helicopter sent by an organ harvesting team scheduled to land, Zach's relatives gathered to say their goodbyes, including his adoring grandmother.
And I went in and I prayed right there.
What were you asking for?
Just a miracle. That he was too young for God to take him. wasn't time.
Zach's cousins, Dan and Christy Coffin, who are both nurses, thought the same thing. And that's why Dan decided to run the shaft of his pocket knife across Zach's foot.
He jerked his foot plumb out of my hand.
Then Dan dug his fingernail beneath Zach's.
That's a tender area. And Zach just threw his hand over here. And by now, this
So
kind of...
he physically moved that arm over his
away
body.
from me, across his body.
And I kind of drew up inside myself, you know, and I'm like, oh my God.
As for Zach's parents,
we went from the lowest possible moment to, oh my gosh,
our
son is alive.
I imagine you're still, though, not getting your hopes up because you don't really know
very guarded.
what he's going to be like.
We had no idea what we were facing.
but when could anyone be sure Zach could ever be more than a profoundly brain-damaged patient? That answer came in the following weeks and months. Zach would awake, and then some. 48 days after the accident that nearly took his life, Zach came home to a hero's welcome.
Yeah. And this morning, we're lucky enough to have Zach himself here, along with his parents, Doug and Pam, and his younger sister, Casey. Good morning to you. Also great to see you all back here once again. Good morning. And you are looking great. How are you feeling?
I feel pretty good, but it's just hard.
It seems like every time I see you that, you know, there's a look in your eyes, it's back, you've got that spark back, so you're really on the road to recovery here.
Yeah, I just ain't got the patience.
You just don't have the patience. You want to be better right away. Do you remember what happened leading up to the accident and any of the time right after?
Well, I remember a little bit. That was about an hour before the accident happened, and then about 6 hours before that I remember. And I remember eating at the church after the parade. And that's about it.
One thing that you told me that really, I had goosebumps after you told me this, was that the one thing you do remember, you seem to have some kind of out-of-body recollection almost, was that you heard the doctors pronounce you dead. You heard that, right? What was your reaction? What did you hear?
I'm glad I couldn't get up and do what I wanted to do.
You wanted to get up and shake them and say, I'm still in here, I'm alive?
Probably would have been a broken window that went out.
Pam, when you see your son here now almost 4 months after what happened, and to think what you went through, the unimaginable, where you know, on that Monday you had gone through just signing off for the organ donation, and 4 hours later you were told, wait a minute, everything's on hold, he's alive. Can you take me back to that moment?
That was the most miraculous feeling. I mean, we had gone, like we said, from the lowest possible emotion that a parent could feel to the top of the mountains again. I mean, it was, we were still very guarded because we weren't sure what his prognosis would be, but just to hear the words that he was back with us was something that I'll remember forever.
Doug, there is, as you said, no fault here. You're not blaming anyone, the hospital or anything, for what happened. I mean, you saw those tests, right? What did those tests indicate to you?
There was no activity at all, no blood flow at all.
No blood flow into the brain.
Right.
So you were ready to say goodbye to your son at that point.
We didn't want him as a vegetable, you know. We didn't know what he was going to be like, but they said that he was brain dead and there would be no life, so we were preparing ourselves, and Zach has always been a giver, and he always wanted to make sure everybody had things going their way, and he didn't want to give up, and we didn't want his organs to give up either, and he didn't either.
So you were ready to allow somebody else to live on with your son's organs. Casey, meanwhile, I know that your grandmother, Naomi, as we saw, she was praying for a miracle. The whole town, in fact, was praying for this miracle. Do you think that that is actually what worked here? Do you think that's the reason your brother's sitting here?
Yes, I do.
And can you believe your eyes? Are you pinching yourself every morning seeing your brother? And pinching him still? You're still here?
Yeah.
Pam, I can't even begin to imagine what every day must be like for you now, though. I mean, on this road to recovery, I know he's getting his memory back. How's he doing? What are some of the things he's still going to have to struggle with?
He's been doing amazingly well, but you know, he does still have a lot of memory issues, and it just takes a long time for the brain to heal after such a traumatic injury.
It was a catastrophic injury.
It was. And you know, and it may take a year or more before he completely recovers, but that's okay. It doesn't matter how long it takes. We're just so thankful and blessed that we have him here.
And you're helping him every step of the way. Are you,
Yes.
in the meantime, are you trying to spur those memories, trying to jog that memory back?
We do.
Yeah.
We talk about things that he used to do when he was younger, and he remembers a lot of those things. Some of the things we might not want him to remember.
Yes. Well, I know that you're getting ready to start driving again soon. Is that right?
I've been wanting to drive about the day I was back from rehab.
I bet. I bet you're not going to be driving any ATVs, though, right?
Matters on the helmet.
Meanwhile, though, you do have something. You have that pocket knife with you. What do you, when you look at this pocket knife now and you think the symbolicness of this, the fact that this is what they rubbed on the bottom of your foot, Dan and Christy, your cousins, what do you think when you look at that thing?
It just makes me thankful. It makes me thankful that they didn't give up.
Thank goodness, right?
And only the good die young, so it's good to go.
Wow, you're doing great. We're so glad you're doing great. Zach, Doug, Pam, and Casey, great to have you all here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that sets the stage for the day, and instead of just telling you about those cases, and those are just some of the ones that make it to television, and there are many others. And the question, of course, is that if the transplanters had gotten Zach's beating heart, he would clearly be dead, and only because he had relatives who work in the intensive care unit is he able to respond on the television as we've seen him. How did I start to study this subject? This baby, Joseph, was the one who started my study. Joseph had flat brain waves while he was still on the ventilator about 5 weeks after his delivery. We didn't take his organs. We didn't turn off his ventilator, even though his brain waves were interpreted as consistent with cerebral death. That's what was written on his chart. It did not make sense to me. So we continued to treat him. This is Joseph when he's about 7. And when Joseph went to school, he got straight A's, excellent grades. He ran track, he played baseball. This is Joseph as an adult and married, and they since have another child, so they have 3 children.
You know, money being in the equation, it's funny, me and my wife were talking a couple months ago, and or maybe a month ago, and somehow the subject of being an organ donor came up. You know, and we were chatting about this, right? And I said to my wife, I'm like, no, I'm like, you should never be an organ donor. Don't be an organ donor. And my wife's like, what in the world? Why not? You know, you got to help all these people with organs. And I said, no. I said, I heard about this, and I said, I don't remember the details, but I heard about this, how they'll basically kill you for your organs because they make money off the organs. And she's like, no way. You know, we were kind of talking about it, and she wasn't buying it. And I couldn't really convince her because I couldn't remember the fact. I couldn't remember the information. Okay, then like a week later, she happened to see a news article about it that explained exactly what I was telling her. And since then, my wife did a ton of research on it, and she looked it up. And here's the thing, it's impossible to take the organs out of a corpse. Yep. They can only harvest the organs while you're still alive. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, this person can't survive. It's too late for them. Can we go ahead and harvest their organs? But see, here's the thing, though. I'm sure that sometimes that's true, that the person's, you know, about to die or dying and they really are going to die. So yeah, let's harvest their organs and save someone else's life. But you know what? But there's money associated with it. There's money for these kidney transplants and these other, you know, organ transplants. So what will often happen is that basically, you know what? You're in pretty bad shape. Let's go ahead and harvest those organs, even though you totally could have survived and could have made it. You know, I mean, I'm thinking if my wife's in the hospital, And they're coming to me saying, you know what, we don't think your wife's going to make it. We're going to go ahead and harvest these organs. I'm going to say, no. I mean, you need to do everything you can. Let's wait until the bitter end. You know, let's let her die on her own, you know, and let's pray to God that at the last minute, because you know what, there are a lot of people where they'll say like, oh, this person's brain dead, this person's gone, it's too late, and then 2 weeks later they walk out of the hospital. My wife just showed me a news article like that. This guy, they said, oh man, there's no way, you know, we're going to stop feeding him, he's done, he's over, and then he gets up and walks out a week later and he's completely full recovery. So, you see how money can sometimes corrupt judgment? You know, when you're thinking to yourself, oh, you know, we can make all this money off this kidney transplant, they're going to harvest out of you while you're still alive.
Most people are going to find these facts very, very disturbing and downright horrifying. I'm going to start off by explaining the basic procedures for organ harvesting. Then I will show you some official documents from organ procurement organizations that turn out the guidelines and protocols to verify that what I said is in fact true. After that, I'm going to go a little bit over the current laws, because if you do want to avoid being harvested, you need to know what the laws are and take specific steps. Vital organs are harvested 2 different ways. 90% of the time, they are taken from a body that is living and breathing and the individual's been diagnosed as brain dead. And from the brain dead, they can get each type of organ. They can get hearts, livers, lungs, intestines, etc. 5 to 10% of the time, they do take them from people that have undergone cardiac death, although in that case, they can typically only harvest kidneys and livers, and the death has to happen under controlled circumstance. So what they do is they take ventilator-dependent individuals that have agreed to this or that are brain damaged and their families agreed to turn the ventilator off. They set them up on an operating table, then they turn the ventilator off and they wait for them to die. As soon as the heart stops, they time 3 to 5 minutes after and they start cutting. And this is also tricky because the person has to die in a timely manner, typically within 1 hour for most hospitals. And if they don't die in that hour, they're supposed to be taken back to their room to die naturally, at which point all of the organs are lost. They cannot be harvested. The organ harvesting procedure for people that are brain dead typically takes about 4 to 6 hours. And during that time, they are kept on the ventilator, their heart is beating, they're breathing the entire time, until usually at the end the heart is the last organ that's taken, at which point they die. These brain-dead individuals do not receive any anesthesia. However, they are given paralytic drugs, and that's because when they start to cut them open, typically they do in fact move. In addition, their vital signs typically start to spike as soon as the cutting starts. Under normal circumstances, if you went in for surgery and your vital signs spiked when the surgeon cut you, the anesthesiologist would take that as a sign that you're not under deeply enough, and he would increase your level of anesthesia. In the case of these people diagnosed brain dead, they just don't worry about it. Now, you may think it doesn't matter if these people receive painkillers or anesthesia, because they use very sophisticated tests to ensure that they are in fact brain dead. In reality, that is hardly the case. In layman's terms, the tests they run would be the equivalent of checking to see if someone's breathing, poking them with a stick, shining a light in their eyes to see if their pupils respond, and maybe shooting some cold water in their ear, and that's it. In fact, the OPOs, the organ procurement manuals that come out that tell hospitals how to run these tests, actually discourage the use of EEGs or nuclear brain flow studies or any sophisticated test unless they have to do it because the rudimentary tests cannot be completed. Many individuals have woken up after they were declared brain dead. In some cases, they've woken up after they were scheduled for organ harvesting procedures, and in others, at least one, they woke up on the operating table as the doctors were getting ready to harvest their organs. And in many cases, these people are not even brain damaged. There's a number of conditions that are known to mimic brain death. In some cases, the condition leaves them completely alert and awake, but unable to move, and so without sophisticated tests, these people look like their brain is shot. And they know this. This is a statistical reality. Yet nevertheless, the hospitals and the OPOs are fine using rudimentary tests and just taking the chance that a certain percentage are likely to be cut up alive without anesthesia. Alright, so now for the proof regarding the lack of anesthesia and the brain death testing. There are approximately 57 federally licensed organ procurement organizations operating across the U.S. And in each case, these OPOs get a set of hospitals in their area, and those hospitals are legally bound to notify the OPO every time they have a patient that could be brain dead or that is expected to die imminently. Now, these OPOs turn out these official guidebooks telling the hospital what drugs to use, what procedures to use as far as brain death testing, etc. And the hospitals, for the most part, always adhere to these standards. First OPO guide is from LifeGift in Houston, Texas. Clearly states paralytic agents for spinal reflexes will be administered. Other anesthetic not needed. The next guide is from One Legacy out of Los Angeles, California. Take note of that name. You're going to hear about them again later. Organ recovery from the brain-dead donor does not require administration of anesthetic. However, it may be necessary to give paralytic agents to suppress spinal reflexes. And last but not least, we have LifeSource out of St. Paul, Minnesota. Same story, paralytic agents for spinal reflexes is given and other anesthetic not needed. And now let's take a quick look at what one anesthesiologist said about harvesting without anesthesia. The nurses get really, really upset. You stick the knife in and the pulse and blood pressure shoot up. If you don't give anything at all, the patient will start moving and wriggling around and it is impossible to do the operation. The surgeon has always asked us to paralyze the patient. And here we get into the recommended brain death testing clinical exam. Pupils fixed when you shine a light in their eyes. Absent corneal reflex, that would be if you poke them in the eye, do they blink? Absent oculocephalic response. Apparently, if you move their head around, their eyes should continue to return to normal. Absent oculovestibule reflex, cold calorics. That means if you shoot cold water in their ear, their eyes are supposed to move in a certain direction. Absent cough or gag reflex, absent motor response, poke them with a stick. And last, absent respiratory effort, meaning can they breathe? Okay, so what about confirmatory tests like an EEG? These tests are optional. However, they should be performed if unable to complete an apnea test. The apnea test is the breathing test. Then it goes on to say, conventional approach is to conduct two clinical tests several hours apart to confirm brain death, or to do a clinical test and then use one of these other tests like brain scan. However, the physician may opt to only conduct one clinical exam, which basically means if you get the answer we want on one test, then let's stop right there and not do any more testing. And notice the last line, which is hugely important for anyone that's an actual donor signed up right now. LifeSource usually becomes involved with the clinical management following the first brain death exam. And the next procedural guidebook, you can see it's exactly the same thing. I won't even bother reading it. Only real difference is this one says that other testing should be ordered only if the clinical exam cannot be performed. So, same deal. So now let's look at some conditions that mimic brain death. Locked-in syndrome, and in that case the people are actually perfectly conscious and alert. They just appear brain dead from the outside. Neuromuscular paralysis, hypothermia, drug intoxication, and Guillain-Barré syndrome. Drug intoxication is a huge one right now because something like 25% of the brain dead organ donors are people that have overdosed on opiates. And from what I've read, neurologists suggest that you need to wait at least 7 to 10 days before you diagnose someone like that has that many drugs in their system as being brain dead. Only problem is, I've also read that 97 to 99% of adults that are actually brain dead, meaning the brain stem itself has died, will die on a respirator from a heart attack within about a week, because the brain stem also controls your electrolytes and your body temperature, and it sends them into heart attacks. So you have to ask yourself, do you think folks really want to wait 7 to 10 days to see if these opiate overdose victims die of a heart attack and all their organs are ruined? Or do you think maybe they want to speed things up a little? I tell you, after you read or after I show you some of the case studies, the answer I think is going to be pretty obvious in a lot of cases. And it's widely acknowledged in medical communities that the whole concept of brain death was invented after they realized that to have the best organ transplant success, you had to harvest the organs from a living, breathing body. Before that, brain death didn't exist. You were either dead or you were in a deep coma. And the doctors, if you look into it, they're open about this. They know these people are not completely brain dead. I mean, some of them might be, but if they are, they're going to die very, very quickly on their own. Okay, so now for some important legal information so you understand what you need to do if you want to prevent your organs from being harvested. All states use a version of the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, Well, what is that? It's this group of lawyers that writes what they believe, or more accurately, what the OPOs and organ harvesters believe would be the ideal state law governing organ harvesting. And they write up this generic law, and then they hand it to each state and say, you need to pass this so that you can save more lives. And then the states generally vote on it and pass it unanimously without even really understanding what the law entails. The first one was written in 1968, then 86, then 2006, and since then they are turning out revised amendments every year pretty much. And every single time it gives the OPOs more rights, more power. So in 2006 there was a major change. Up until that point, the family ultimately had the final say as to whether organs would be harvested. In 2006 they changed that. They said the donor, his rights will be protected. So if he's registered as a donor, the family has no right to give consent or retract consent. Well, what does that really mean? We looked at the brain death testing guidelines, right? They can diagnose you as brain dead and legally dead after one clinical test. The moment that happens, guess who takes control of your health care? The OPO does, because you just became a cadaver, and legally they have the right to manage the cadaver until the organs are harvested. So if your family wants more tests, legally that's just too bad. Their rights have been severed at that point. The only rights they do have is to get your corpse back after the organs have been taken out for burial. It was a case in Ohio where 21-year-old signed up as an organ donor on his driver's license. He got hit by a car and was declared brain dead. The family did not want his organs harvested. They wanted him taken off the ventilator to see if he could breathe on his own. The OPO went to a judge and got the court order to harvest his organs. I think the family found out after it had been done, and they were not too happy. And yes, it was a live breathing body organ harvesting procedure. Since 2006, the newer versions have even more laws that benefit the organ harvesters. For instance, number 3, it used to be that minors or parents would have to agree to harvesting, but now any 15 or 16-year-old kid that can apply for a driver's license can sign up as an organ donor, and their parents are not going to have any say in it. And in addition, number 4, it used to be only next of kin. If you were not a donor, only next of kin could, sign your organs away and let you be harvested alive. But now they've changed it to include any adult who has exhibited special care and concern for the decedent. So if they can't get your family members, they can, I guess if a neighbor or a coworker visits you in the hospital, they can say that person showed special care for you, and now that your neighbor or coworker could sign off and let your organs be harvested. It's unbelievable. And every year they're coming out with more laws that benefit these people. Now, in all fairness, there is a hierarchy. In other words, first they ask the spouse or the parents. If they're not available, then they go to siblings. They can't just run off and get your neighbor to sign up if your spouse said no. But everything in these laws is so incredibly vague. They say that they need to reach this person in a reasonable amount of time. Well, what the hell does that mean? They left a voicemail and they didn't respond for 30 minutes, so now they're going to another family member? It's all very vague, and it all benefits the OPOs. Okay, so how can you prevent having your organs harvested against your will? Well, first off, obviously get off any donor registries that you're currently on. And if you've moved from another state recently, make sure you're off the other state's registry too, just to be safe. Secondly, understand they're going to drop your name. They're not going to list you as refusing to donate, because that goes against their interests. Then you need to get a form. I wish I could give you links to forms, like in your state, but I can't find that many, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't even want to tell you which one would be best. If I were doing one, I would just use a generic one like this, because I can't find any specific for Georgia. You want it signed, you want it in your wallet with your driver's license. You want to make sure relatives have it. You want to make sure if you have to check into a hospital for surgery, they've got a copy of it, because it's really only paper documents that are going to save you in this situation. Some sources say you should also have it signed by 2 independent witnesses, but then other sources say that's not necessary, so it's your call. It is also a good idea to have at least one tough, ornery relative that understands this, has a copy of it, and will speak on your behalf. That way, if the OPO or a hospital started giving someone a hard time, your relative can throw this paper in their face and threaten to sue the whole lot of them. In addition, it'd probably be a good idea to threaten to go to the media and make the OPO and the hospital look like a bunch of sociopathic, organ-stealing monsters. The one thing these people do not like is bad publicity. And when you look at their procedure guidelines, they also have a section just on basically how to pressure the family. So a weaker family member would have a really hard time standing up against these people. No member of the donation team, the doctor, the nurse, social worker, chaplain, should mention donation to a family before participating in a team huddle. The team huddle assembles as many direct caregivers as possible prior to the family approach and creates a forum for exchanging information about the donor and the donor family. So the OPO agent gathers all the information she can by talking to everyone involved, and that way she can create the perfect approach to talk these people into signing the papers. In addition, if you look further down, the Joint Commission regulations and state law state that only a LifeGift donation coordinator may discuss donation with the family. So they've actually passed a law that these hospitals, the nurses, the doctors, they are not allowed to bring it up because they might say the wrong thing, or God forbid, they might warn people against it. And if there are any Canadian or European viewers that think American laws are crazy, be warned, a lot of European countries are even worse. They're going with opt-out laws, which means everyone by default is an organ donor unless they sign paperwork stating they refuse. And I believe those laws also apply to tourists. So if you're planning to visit France anytime soon, you might want to spend a few bucks and get travel insurance, because with travel insurance, if you get injured, they actually do life flight you back to your country of origin. All right, so I am not going to include any specific cases in this video. This video is long enough. I will say I came across so many, and I just did a follow-up video that highlights two that are particularly interesting. There are so many where they end up in criminal cases or investigations by the U.S. Health Department. And these cases involve, we're talking drug overdoses, they're falsifying hospital records, they're telling the families all kinds of things that are absolutely not true to get these people to sign paperwork for harvesting. So I'm going to link the video that I just did with two cases. One of them is just fascinating. It's a homicide investigation that's currently going on in Los Angeles. And the interesting part about it is the document that was filed in court alleges that there has been a long-term conspiracy between the Los Angeles Coroner's Department and One Legacy, the OPO in Los Angeles. And it strongly suggests that they have been overdosing cardiac death patients with massive amounts of drugs, and the coroner's office has been covering up for it, allegedly. But it is a current homicide investigation, and that's really interesting. So I'm linking that video. It's a good watch. There's no boring legal stuff in it. It's a very interesting story. Okay? Thank you so much for watching this. I put a little poll up if you want to vote on if this changed your mind about organ donation, and stay safe.
So what happens when we die? It's a question that humanity has wrestled with throughout history. But a new study conducted by NYU may have found some answers. Dr. Sam Parnia is the Director of Critical Care and Resuscitation Research at NYU Langone School of Medicine, where he ran this study. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Parnia.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What would you say? What actually happens when you're clinically dead?
Well, you know, when people die, essentially it's when the heart stops. So this has been going on for, as far as we know, millennia, not longer. And when the heart stops, you stop breathing and your brain shuts down, and that's how we declare people dead. And that's why we give a time of death and we give them a note. And really, to be honest with you, until about 50 years ago, that was the point of death. So people become lifeless, motionless, the brain shuts down. But now through advances in medicine, we can actually bring people back to life even after they've gone beyond that threshold of death, and study what happens to them. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that the brain completely shuts down, as I said. But what's fascinating is that the cells inside the body, and particularly the cells inside the brain, do not suddenly become annihilated. They go through a process of decay that can take a few hours, which is why we can actually medically bring people back to life after they have technically gone beyond that threshold of death for tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards. And that, of course, raises many interesting questions about what happens when we die.
So tell me more about this study. How did you conduct it? And tell me about, how you came about reaching your findings, your conclusion.
I'm an intensive care doctor, so my job is to essentially save people's lives and prevent them from dying. But unfortunately, people do die, and we try to revive them. What we have found is that over the last few decades, many millions of people have now come back, and many of them have reported, actually, anecdotally, that they've been able to see and hear things going on, even though from our perspective, they should have been dead and their brain should not be functioning at all. And so we became intrigued to study this, one, because it was fascinating, and two, because we tried to revive people without brain damage and to ensure they don't have any disorders of consciousness, so not becoming like brain damaged or having a vegetative state. At any rate, so this particular study is the largest study ever carried out in the world. It was done in 15 medical centers across the US and in Europe. And we studied more than 2,000 people who'd gone through this cardiac arrest or process of death. And we did not expect people to have any consciousness or awareness. But intriguingly, up to 40% of people came back and had a perception of being aware of what was happening to them, even though they had technically gone beyond the threshold of death.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot to it. I should also add that among that group, 10% had a very deep, profound mystical experience that was very true to them. But interestingly, 2% actually had full awareness, could describe all the events that were going on that were validated. So of course the question is, why does that happen? And we don't have the answers, because to our scientific model, when people have died, there should be no more conscious awareness going on. But it sounds like maybe consciousness is able to continue. And by that, I don't mean that they're awake, but that entity that makes us who we are, makes Sam who he is, makes Rena who she is, the self, the mind, seems to continue and doesn't become annihilated after a person has gone through their process of death.
Were there any of the people that you studied that completely lost all consciousness?
Well, that's what I was trying to explain.
Yeah.
Everybody loses consciousness immediately as soon as the heart stops. It's not like they're awake and watching us.
Well, you mentioned that there were some people who remembered there was some sort of mystical experience that they were going through. Were there some people who said, nope, didn't feel anything, didn't?
So some people don't have any recollections. What we don't know is whether they had experiences and forgot it afterwards, and that may be what's happening. Because of course we forget a lot of things, and most of the people who are brought back have issues to do with their treatments. We give them sedative drugs, which wipes out their memories. So that's part of what we're studying now, is does everybody have this experience? And how long does mind and consciousness continue in some format, even though we've gone beyond the threshold of death?
Do you have some sort of conclusion as to how far the mind and consciousness goes?
Again, from what we can determine, which is actually fascinating, and it raises questions about our whole science, about what happens when we die, is that it appears that even though people have gone beyond that threshold of death and their brain has shut down, that entity that we call consciousness, the mind, the psyche, whatever you want to call it, does not seem to become annihilated. From the evidence we have, that at least tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards, how long beyond that, we don't know at this point.
For the folks who have lost consciousness and come back, have there been any long-term effects afterwards?
Well, those people who have these very deep, profound, mystical experiences, often they describe a sensation of being very peaceful, seeing a bright, warm, welcoming light, sometimes deceased relatives. And intriguingly, some of them describe a sensation of a being that they describe as being perfect and full of light and love and compassion. Those who have that experience are often very positively transformed for the rest of their lives. It's very profound, it's real to them. They become less afraid of death. They lose their fear of death completely. They engage in altruism. They're more helpful to people. They engage more with family. It completely changes them. So there's something very profound about this experience that they have.
We often hear people say, I saw the light, some sort of light. Why do you think it is that some people see that and some people don't?
Well, so there are two possibilities. One is that, as you said, only some people see it, and we think that, you know, it might be 10%. But the alternative is that everyone sees it, but unfortunately, because of the medical treatments that they get afterwards in the intensive care unit by doctors such as myself, to save their brain, they forget it. And one of our new studies is trying to actually decipher whether people have had it but just forgotten about it. And so I think there is some evidence that more people are having it, but unfortunately they just forget it afterwards.
It's a fascinating study and a fascinating look into death and those final moments as well, and returning back. Dr. Sam Parnia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So you see how money can sometimes corrupt judgment? You know, when you're thinking to yourself, oh, you know, we can make all this money off this kidney transplant, they're going to harvest out of you while you're still alive.